You should be grateful I still keep you around." That's what my husband said, standing in our kitchen, coffee mug in hand, as if those words weren't a knife twisting inside me. I'd heard cruel things before, but never delivered so casually, so coldly. That was the night I stopped waiting for him to see my worth and started seeing it myself. My name is Linda Myers, and I'm 58 years old. Tell me where you're watching from, because maybe you've heard words like that too. Words that slice right through the years you've given, the dinners you've cooked, the birthdays you've remembered when they forgot yours. I live in a small town in North Carolina where the magnolia trees bloom early and gossip travels faster than spring rain. For 30 years, I was Mrs. Richard Myers, the woman who always smiled beside the man who never stopped talking about himself. People said we had the perfect marriage. Maybe we did, if you measured perfection by silence and sacrifice. That morning started like any other. I made his breakfast, packed his lunch, ironed his shirt. He sat scrolling through his phone, chuckling at something, not once looking up. When I asked if he could drop off the donation box at the church, he sighed, long and loud, as though my voice itself were an inconvenience. Then came that sentence. "You should be grateful I still keep you around." He said it half smiling, not realizing that after all these years, I had finally run out of silence. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I just stood there, my hand still on the coffee pot, watching the steam rise like smoke from something burning down. In that moment, I remembered the woman I used to be, the 28-year-old teacher who laughed too loudly and painted on weekends, the woman who had dreams before they were dismissed as silly. Richard wasn't always cruel. When we met, he was charming in the way men can be when they're still trying. He brought me flowers, remembered my favorite book, even wrote me notes on napkins. We got married in a small chapel surrounded by friends who swore we were soulmates. But somewhere between our mortgage payments, his promotions, and my quiet resignations, love turned into hierarchy. He began correcting me mid-sentence at dinners. He took over our finances to simplify things. He made jokes about my weight, my hair, my mood swings, and when I withdrew, to keep the peace, he mistook my silence for consent. The truth is, I stayed because I believed in vows, because I thought enduring meant strength, because every time he made me feel small, I told myself I was lucky he hadn't left. That's the thing about slow cruelty. You stop noticing the cut because the bleeding becomes background noise. That night, after his little declaration of dominance, Richard went to bed early, complaining about his workload. I sat in the kitchen long after the lights dimmed, tracing the rim of my coffee cup and thinking of the words, "keep you around," as if I were furniture, as if 30 years of loyalty and love were something to store, not cherish. The refrigerator hummed in the background. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window. And for the first time in years, I let myself imagine what life would look like without him. The thought scared me, but it also felt like breathing fresh air after years underground. I remembered my daughter, Anna, calling me a few weeks earlier. "Mom," she'd said gently, "you sound tired all the time. Are you okay?" I told her I was fine. Mothers do that. We protect our children from truths that might make them worry. But sitting there, I realized fine was the biggest lie I'd ever told. Richard's snoring echoed faintly from the bedroom. I looked at his half-finished coffee mug and thought about all the things I'd left half-finished in my own life. My art classes, my garden, my confidence. That was the first night in decades that I didn't clear the table or wash the dishes. I left them exactly where they were, crumbs, stains, and all. A small rebellion, but mine. Before bed, I looked at my reflection in the mirror, the lines around my eyes, the gray in my hair. They weren't signs of age. They were records of survival. For years, I had believed his version of me, that I was lucky he still kept me around. But now, standing there, I felt something different rise inside me, a quiet kind of fire. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, But I knew this. I was done apologizing for existing. I was done shrinking so he could feel tall. And as I turned off the light that night, I whispered to my reflection, softly but clearly, "He thinks he's keeping me. He has no idea I'm already gone." People often think betrayal happens in one grand moment. A discovered affair, a shouted confession, a broken promise that cracks everything open. But sometimes, betrayal is quieter. It happens over years, one small humiliation at a time, until you wake up realizing you've been living with a stranger who calls himself your husband. After that night in the kitchen, Richard acted as if nothing had happened. He still expected breakfast on the table by 7, shirts pressed, socks matched, and I, like I'd done for decades, did everything as usual. But this time, my silence wasn't submission. It was study. I began noticing things I used to ignore, how he'd introduce me at gatherings as my wife. She used to teach before she got tired. How his eyes would roll when I spoke about something I cared about. Books, art, the little volunteer group at church. How he'd correct my pronunciation just to prove he could. He never raised his hand, but his tone could bruise. Our daughter, Anna, was grown now, living 2 states away with her husband and little boy. She adored her father, or at least the version she'd seen growing up, the provider, the jokester, the man who'd twirl her around the living room on Saturday mornings. I never let her see the nights he came home cold, wordless, irritated at invisible things. I carried that silence like armor, protecting her, even from the truth. Sometimes I'd catch myself defending him to friends. He's under stress. He doesn't mean it. He's just tired. But deep down, I knew he'd long stopped seeing me as a person. To him, I was part of the furniture. Reliable, predictable, replaceable. One Saturday evening, we attended a dinner at his colleague's house. It was one of those glossy suburban affairs. Wine glasses sparkling under warm light. Everyone politely pretending their marriages were perfect. I told a small story. Something innocent about the first year of our marriage, when we couldn't afford air conditioning and used to sleep on the porch to stay cool. Richard interrupted with a laugh that made the room pause. "Oh, don't listen to her," he said. "She's remembering it wrong. She's always dramatic." Everyone laughed politely. I did too, because that's what you do when your husband publicly calls you foolish. But inside, I felt something fracture. Not because he embarrassed me, but because he enjoyed it. On the drive home, he hummed to the radio, oblivious. And I sat there staring out the window, wondering how many times I'd let that happen. That night, I found an old journal buried in a drawer, the kind I used to write in when I was younger. The pages smelled faintly of lavender and ink. I started writing again, quietly at first. A few lines before bed, thoughts I couldn't say out loud. What began as whispers turned into confessions. I miss who I was. I want my life back. He doesn't love me. He owns me. The words terrified me, but they also made me feel alive again. It was as if I was remembering myself sentence by sentence. Weeks passed. The house stayed clean, dinners cooked, smiles rehearsed. But my heart wasn't on autopilot anymore. I began noticing small inconsistencies in Richard's stories. Business trips that didn't align with his calendar, late nights at the office followed by evasive explanations. When I'd ask innocent questions, he'd sigh dramatically. "For God's sake, Linda, you're paranoid. You don't understand how work works." And I'd nod, as though his condescension were wisdom. But something in me was changing. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found a receipt tucked in his pants pocket. A jewelry store, dated 2 months prior. It wasn't my birthday, it wasn't Christmas. He hadn't given me jewelry in years. When I asked about it, he barely looked up from his laptop. "Oh, it was a client gift." His voice was flat, dismissive, but his eyes, they flickered just long enough for me to know he was lying. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching fireflies dance, in the dark. For years, I had begged God for signs, to fix our marriage, to make him see me again. But maybe the signs were never about fixing him. Maybe they were about freeing me. I began imagining my life in fragments, my own bank account, my own address, my own peace. Each thought terrified me, but also thrilled me in quiet ways. A few days later, while dusting his study, I found a locked drawer I'd never noticed before. The key was taped under the desk, hidden like an afterthought. Inside were envelopes neatly stacked, bank statements, letters, documents, some with names I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I read the first one, and in that moment, the fog of confusion that had clouded my marriage for years began to clear. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I knew this, and whatever he was hiding, it wasn't love. I placed everything back exactly as it was, shut the drawer, and took a deep breath. The old Linda, the one who stayed silent, would have pretended she saw nothing. But that night, I picked up my journal again and wrote a single line across the page. If he thinks I'm blind, he's about to find out how sharp my eyes can be. The drawer haunted me. For 3 nights I couldn't sleep knowing what sat behind that locked handle. The truth, folded neatly in envelopes, waiting. Every creak of the house made me flinch, half afraid Richard might catch me staring too long at his secrets. By the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. When he left for work the next morning, I brewed my coffee, closed the curtains, and unlocked the drawer again. This time, I wasn't trembling. I was focused. There were bank statements, accounts I'd never seen before, under his name but tied to a separate P.O. box. One folder was labeled Consulting Expenses. Inside, there were printed statements with regular transfers, $100, $2,500, $3,100, all to a woman named Samantha Lewis. I whispered the name out loud like it might explain itself. Samantha, not a coworker I'd ever heard of, not a family friend. My chest tightened. Every part of me wanted to stop reading, to slam the drawer shut and pretend it was all a misunderstanding. But another part, the part that had been quiet for too long, kept turning the pages. There were emails, too. I didn't read them all. But one subject line was enough to make my vision blur. Weekend plans confirmed, same hotel. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the paper. I sat there for a long time, staring at his handwriting, at the receipts from hotels in Asheville, Charleston, and once even Atlanta, all places he claimed to have work trips. The betrayal didn't come like a storm. It came like a slow, icy flood that crept up my spine until I couldn't breathe. I wasn't angry yet, just hollow. 30 years of loyalty, of shared holidays, of late-night talks that turned into one-sided monologues. All of it now felt like background noise to a lie. When I heard his car pull into the driveway that evening, I tucked everything back exactly as I'd found it. Dinner was already in the oven. Baked chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans, the usual. He walked in, kissed me on the forehead, and said, "You always know how to make home feel like home." I smiled. My lips moved, but my heart didn't. Later that night, while he watched television, I sat beside him, pretending to read. My mind was miles away, racing through the past few months, replaying every late-night phone call, every weekend conference, every evasive explanation. The puzzle pieces fit too perfectly. He hadn't just drifted emotionally, he'd planned this, a double life hidden under the veneer of respectability. The next morning, I called an old friend, Janet, someone I'd taught with years ago before I left the classroom to manage our home. Janet now worked as a paralegal at a small law firm. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but when she picked up and heard my voice, she said, "Linda, you sound different. What's going on?" I didn't cry. I told her everything, the drawer, the documents, the name. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Linda, you need to be careful. Don't confront him yet. Gather proof, quietly." Her voice was firm, the kind of voice women use when they've seen too many stories like mine end badly. That afternoon, I bought a small USB drive from the local store. Every time Richard left the house, I copied a few more files. Statements, receipts, photos of the documents. I organized them neatly, just like lesson plans from my teaching days. One night, while transferring files, I found a life insurance policy, not ours, listing Samantha Lewis as the emergency contact. I felt the blood drain from my face. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally or physically. He was preparing for a future that didn't include me at all. I remember standing in our hallway mirror, looking at my reflection. I didn't see heartbreak anymore. I saw calculation. I was terrified. But I wasn't helpless. The next day, Richard left for another client meeting in Charleston. When he kissed my cheek, I almost laughed. I could smell her perfume on his collar. Something floral, cheap, not mine. The moment his car turned the corner, I called Janet again. She gave me the name of a local attorney, Miss Peterson, and told me, "Linda, go see her. Don't wait until he files first." That night, I sat at my desk with the evidence spread before me. For 30 years, Richard had taught me to doubt myself, to believe I couldn't survive without him. But now, every document I gathered whispered the same truth. I was the one holding everything together. I always had been. When Richard came home late, I pretended to be asleep. He slipped into bed smelling faintly of wine and someone else's perfume. I lay still, eyes open, heart steady. He thought I didn't know. He thought I was still that quiet wife who'd take anything to keep the peace. But under the blanket, I clenched my hand around the flash drive hidden in my palm like a secret weapon. If he's building a new life, I thought, then so will I. But mine will start with the truth. The law office sat quietly at the end of Main Street, between an old bakery and a faded antiques shop. It looked harmless. White shutters, brick steps, a small brass plate that read, "Peterson and Cole Attorneys at Law." But to me, walking through that door felt like crossing into another world, one where I wasn't Richard Myers' wife anymore, but Linda Myers, individual. The receptionist smiled kindly. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "with Miss Peterson." A few minutes later, I was sitting across from Amelia Peterson, a woman in her early 50s with intelligent eyes and a calmness that made you feel safe before she even spoke. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything. 30 years of control, the condescension, the drawer, the emails, the money. When I finished, she folded her hands and said softly, "Linda, you've been preparing for this for years. You just didn't know it." I stared at her. "Preparing?" "Yes, you've been surviving, enduring, paying attention. That's what strength looks like. It just wears a quieter face when you're still inside the storm." Her words broke something open inside me. I nodded, blinking fast to keep the tears from falling. Ms. Peterson explained what needed to happen next. Gather all financial records, both shared and hidden. Copy every document before he notices anything missing. Stop using the joint bank account. And above all, don't confront him yet. "Richard sounds like a man who values control," she said. "If he senses he's losing it, he'll get defensive, maybe even dangerous. You need the element of surprise." I sat there clutching my purse like a lifeline. How do I even start? She smiled. "You've already started. Now let's finish what he began." When I left her office, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner. The magnolia trees that lined the street swayed in the wind, and for the first time in years, I noticed how beautiful the day was. That evening, I waited until Richard fell asleep before pulling out the USB drive again. I organized the files into folders, labeling each one carefully. Bank accounts, travel receipts, life insurance, emails. Each folder felt like a piece of armor being fastened around me. Over the next few weeks, my life became a quiet operation. By day, I played the part, the pleasant wife who asked about his meetings, who smiled at neighbors, who kept the house spotless. By night, I gathered documents, photographed files, and met discreetly with Miss Peterson and Janet, my friend from the law office. The three of us formed a secret rhythm, quiet women with a shared purpose. Sometimes I'd sit across from Ms. Peterson as she reviewed everything, her pen tapping gently on the desk. "You're in a better position than you think," she said once. "He's been careless. You've been patient." Richard, meanwhile, was too arrogant to notice the shift. He came home later each week, offering vague excuses. He'd pour himself a drink, talk about business expansions, and tell me how lucky I was to have a man like him. "Most women your age are lonely," he said one night, swirling his whiskey. "Be grateful you've got stability." That word again, grateful. I smiled at him, my face calm, my hand steady on the table. Inside, I thought, you'll learn what gratitude really means when the papers arrive. Sometimes I'd sit in bed pretending to read while he scrolled through his phone. The glow of the screen lit his face, and I wondered if he was texting her. Samantha. I used to feel pain at the thought. Now I just felt clarity. One night, as he slept, I stood by the window looking out at the streetlight flickering through the blinds. My reflection stared back at me, older, yes, but unbroken. I whispered, "You can't erase me, Richard. Not from this house. Not from my own story." A week later, Ms. Peterson called. "Linda," she said, "everything's ready. The documents are filed. We'll serve him at work." Quietly, legally, decisively. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of that sink in. After I hung up, I went to the backyard and sat on the old wooden bench Richard once promised to fix, but never did. The air smelled like rain. I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for him to change, waiting for love to return, waiting to feel seen. And now, for the first time, I wasn't waiting anymore. That night, I made dinner like always. Richard came home, kissed my cheek absently, and sat down at the table. He asked, "What's for dinner?" "Freedom," I almost said, but instead I smiled. "Your favorite, chicken and rosemary potatoes." He nodded, content, never guessing that while he was eating, the clock had already started ticking. The next morning, as he left for work, I watched from the doorway, calm, composed, almost serene. He thought he was walking into another ordinary day. He had no idea that by noon, a man in a gray suit would step into his office and hand him an envelope marked divorce petition. And when he opened it, the life he thought he controlled would start unraveling, one signature at a time. He built his world on silence, I whispered to myself. He's about to learn what my silence was worth. They say revenge is sweet, but what I felt that morning wasn't sweetness. It was clarity. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the blinds, slicing across the bed like golden ribbons. Richard was already gone, his cologne still hanging faintly in the air. Sharp, artificial, just like him. I sat up slowly, holding my coffee mug between both hands, and whispered to myself, "Today." It was the day he'd be served. I didn't go to work. Not that day. I took the day off from the community center where I helped organize adult literacy programs. I told them I wasn't feeling well. That wasn't a lie. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. At 10:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Peterson. Delivered. He's been served. I exhaled so sharply I almost laughed. I imagined the scene. Richard sitting at his polished mahogany desk surrounded by colleagues, pretending to be the composed executive. Then a man in a gray suit walks in, quiet, polite, and hands him an envelope. The shock in Richard's face, the stiffness in his shoulders, the quick calculation behind his eyes, realizing he's no longer in control. I poured myself another cup of coffee and smiled. For 30 years, I'd been invisible. That morning, my name, Linda Myers, was printed on every page that would change his life. It took less than 20 minutes for him to call. "Linda!" His voice cracked through the phone, sharp as broken glass. "What the hell did you do?" I took a slow breath. "Good morning, Richard. Don't you good morning me. You had me served at my office in front of my team." His words came out in choked bursts, part rage, part humiliation. I could almost picture him pacing behind his desk, red-faced, veins pulsing at his temple. "I did what I had to do," I said evenly. "You made me look like a fool." "You did that all by yourself, Richard." Silence, just his breath, heavy and uneven. Then, in a lower voice, "You think you can just walk away from 30 years like that? You wouldn't have a roof over your head if it weren't for me." I almost laughed. Funny, because I found the receipts, and the leases, for the roof over her head, too. His breathing hitched. You went through my things?" "I went through our life," I replied. "Turns out it wasn't ours at all." He hung up on me. I stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, staring out the kitchen window at the magnolia tree outside. A gentle breeze rattled the leaves. Somewhere deep in my chest, I felt something ease, a knot loosening after years of being wound too tight. Around noon, my daughter Anna called. She'd already heard the news. Apparently, Richard had tried calling her first, spinning the story that I'd lost my mind. "Mom," she said softly, "what's going on?" I told her everything, every lie, every hidden account, every night I'd spent quietly collecting proof. There was a long pause. Then Anna said something I'll never forget. "I'm proud of you." I blinked back tears. "Proud?" "Yes, you finally chose you." That evening, Richard came home, earlier than usual. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" he shouted. I stayed calm. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. "What I've done," I said quietly, "is stop pretending this is love." He sneered. "You won't win. You think some lawyer's gonna save you? Everything's in my name, Linda. Everything." I turned to face him fully for the first time. "Not anymore." He froze. The confidence in his voice faltered. I placed a small folder on the table. Copies of bank statements, the insurance policy, emails, and proof of his financial misconduct. "I didn't want to destroy you," I said, voice steady. "I wanted to be free. But if you try to take what's mine, I'll make sure the court sees every number on those pages." His face drained of color. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. The man who once told me I should be grateful to be kept around was now standing there, speechless, cornered, afraid. He muttered something under his breath and stormed upstairs, the door slamming hard enough to shake the walls. I didn't follow. I didn't cry. I just walked outside, into the dusk air, and sat on the porch steps. The cicadas were buzzing, the sky bruised purple and gold. For the first time in years, I wasn't anxious about who might walk through that door or what mood they'd be in. I was free, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. As the streetlights flickered on, I whispered to myself, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. Not beside him, but beside my own courage. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, that blend of nerves and authority only such places have. As I walked through the glass doors, clutching my folder of documents, I could almost hear my heartbeat echoing off the marble floors. Richard was already there, standing by his attorney, tall, confident, wearing the same smugness he'd worn our entire marriage. When his eyes met mine, he smirked, as if this was some petty argument I'd eventually apologize for. He leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something, then shot me a glance that said, "You'll never win." But I wasn't the same woman who once shrank under that look. I stood a little taller, my shoulders square. Ms. Peterson placed a reassuring hand on my arm and whispered, "Remember, you have the truth. Let him perform. We'll prevail with facts." The judge entered, and the courtroom hushed. I sat still, my fingers gripping the pen Ms. Peterson had lent me. I didn't need to speak first. My documents would speak for me. Richard's attorney began with his polished voice and rehearsed empathy. "Your Honor, my client has been a devoted husband for over 3 decades. This filing came as a shock, a reaction perhaps to miscommunication, not misconduct." Gestured to Richard, who lowered his head just enough to seem humbled. I could almost laugh. The performance was perfect, every inch of contrition that money could buy. But then Ms. Peterson rose. Her tone was calm, deliberate, the voice of truth delivered without theatrics. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, "my client did not act out of impulse. She acted out of necessity." She placed a binder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed through the room. Inside were the copies. Every statement, every email, every transfer to Samantha Lewis. Richard shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. Ms. Peterson continued, "We have documented evidence of financial concealment, emotional abuse, and fraudulent misrepresentation of marital assets. Mrs. Myers remained silent for years, not out of ignorance, but out of endurance. Until now." The judge flipped through the binder, his brow furrowing. Richard's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her finish." When Ms. Peterson displayed the life insurance policy, the one with Samantha's name as emergency contact, Richard's composure cracked. He turned to his lawyer, whispering frantically. The courtroom watched as the man who had spent decades controlling every conversation, every decision, now struggled to find words. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled. Not from fear, but from weight. "Your Honor," I said softly, "I stayed because I believed in my vows. I believed love meant sacrifice. But somewhere along the way, I stopped existing. My life became about keeping him happy, while he built another life without me." I paused, taking a breath. "I'm not here to destroy him. I'm here to reclaim myself." The silence in the courtroom was thick. Even Richard's lawyer looked down at his notes. The judge nodded slowly. "Mrs. Myers, I appreciate your honesty." He looked at Richard. "And Mr. Myers, I find the evidence presented deeply concerning." The proceedings went on for hours. Details, numbers, property discussions. But I barely heard them. I only saw the look on Richard's face as his control slipped away inch by inch, replaced by disbelief. When the judgment was finally read, it was clear. The house, mine. A fair share of his retirement accounts, mine. Restitution for concealed assets, granted. Richard stared at the judge, then at me. "You planned this," he hissed under his breath. I met his gaze, steady. "You taught me how." For a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes, maybe regret, maybe fury, but it didn't matter anymore. His power over me was gone. Ms. Peterson gathered our papers, smiling softly. "You did beautifully," she whispered. When I stepped outside, the sunlight hit my face, warm and clean. I hadn't realized until that moment how long I'd been living in the shadows of his control. Reporters weren't waiting. No cameras flashed. It wasn't that kind of story. But to me, it felt historic. It was the first day of my real life. Richard walked out a few minutes later, his lawyer beside him. He didn't look at me. He just kept walking toward his car, shoulders hunched, the swagger gone. I watched him drive away and felt nothing. Not hate, not joy, just release. As I stood on those courthouse steps, I whispered the words I'd been waiting decades to say. As I walked out of that courtroom, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a woman reborn. It's been 8 months since the divorce. Some mornings I still wake expecting to hear his footsteps, but instead I hear waves. Steady, calm, honest. I live now in a small coastal town near Wilmington, in a cottage with chipped paint and sunlight that spills across the floor. It's quiet here, and for the first time, that silence feels like peace. I fill my days with simple joys, painting by the porch, teaching art classes to other women who've survived their own storms, baking bread that fills the house with warmth. I see my daughter Anna often. She says I look lighter, freer. Maybe I am. I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without pain. Some evenings I sit outside with tea, watching the horizon turn gold. I think of all those years I believed endurance was love. Now I know love should never demand silence. I pick up my journal and write the same line I tell my students and everyone who listens to my story. Sometimes you don't need revenge. You just need freedom. And when you finally choose yourself, the world becomes wide again. If you're watching this and you feel trapped or unseen, please know it's never too late. You can still start over. I did.